A grand jury this week decided not to charge the officers related to the death of Breonna Taylor. And that gives us an important part of this story, but also highlights what we don't know. It's a uniquely American part of our justice system and a bit of a paradox. So I wanted to take a moment to focus on it today. One thing you should know about the American justice system is that your fate is ultimately decided by a jury of your peers. And that is what a grand jury is. It's made up of a jury of our peers. It's different than a trial jury, though. In a trial jury, you're more at the end of an investigation. You're hearing both sides of a case and you're making a decision. In a grand jury, you're more at the beginning of an investigation because what your job is to help a prosecutor figure out whether or not they are going to charge a person with a crime. Help a prosecutor figure out or determine whether or not someone will be charged with a crime. A grand jury is used differently depending on what state you're in, so it's not the same everywhere. But in the case of Breonna Taylor, a grand jury was tasked with deciding whether or not charges should be filed against these police officers. And ultimately, the grand jury decided no. Why is that? We don't know. And in fact, we may never know because a grand jury is confidential. It's happening behind closed doors. What else is interesting about a grand jury is unlike a trial where you hear both sides of an argument, the grand jury is hearing just from the prosecutor, the person that's going to be responsible for filing the charges. So in the case of Breonna Taylor's lawyers were not presenting in front of the grand jury. The lawyers representing the officers were not presenting in front of a grand jury. Simply the prosecutor was presenting. And so the thinking is that this prosecutor is presenting all the evidence that came forward with the investigation to reach that ultimate decision about whether charges should be filed. It's an interesting part of the justice system, and it's also interesting to note what we've seen over the last several years involving high-profile cases involving a white officer and a Black American. And I'm using very generic terms for this because these cases are very different. But I'm talking about the case of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. I'm talking about the case of Eric Garner in New York. In both of these cases, both Black men died. And in both of these cases, a grand jury was tasked with deciding whether or not the officers should be charged with a crime. In both of these cases, the grand jury came back and said, no, there should be no charges followed. And so what we're seeing with Breonna Taylor is a pattern repeating and a similar public debate about whether or not the system is working or not. So on one side, someone could say, this is the system working. A person should be not charged or tried in the court of public opinion. It needs to happen in a court of law, in front of a jury, with all the evidence presented. Someone else could say, well, this is an example of the system not working because not all sides are present. We actually don't know what evidence was presented, and we're not quite sure if we trust whether or not the evidence that was presented was the right evidence in the right way, or whether or not politics played a role. So those are the two arguments emerging and that are taking place right now. One of the reasons why we don't know what was presented in front of the grand jury in the case of Breonna Taylor is that the attorney general who was representing the state said, well, there's a federal investigation taking place, and there is. And while that investigation is taking place, I'm not releasing any information. And in most cases, that is what happens. We don't see the evidence and we don't necessarily know anything about the jury. In very rare circumstances, we do. There are calls right now for more information to be presented in the case of Breonna Taylor. There is the chance that someone could potentially reopen an investigation or re-examine the evidence to see if other steps should be taken. We'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, we know that there was a civil suit that was settled on behalf of Breonna Taylor's family. We also know that there's no criminal charges going to be filed directly related to the death of Breonna Taylor right now for the officers. And we do know that there's a federal investigation still taking place. So hopefully this is helpful. Again, the grand jury, a unique part of the American justice system, and some interesting questions that can arise. Both sides have very interesting points, and I just wanted to make sure you knew how this is all playing out. On our website, we have a timeline of events, so you can check in and get caught up with this case. And of course, if you have any questions and comments, we love hearing from you, and we only want to equip you with the smartest information out there at Smarter News. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you with more information on smarternews.com.